Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I am excited because we are going to be doing episode 2 of my new series, Scare-apy, where I talk all about how consuming horror media and interacting with horror media can actually be beneficial to someone's mental health. A lot of this series is based on research I have done on my own, as well as my own personal experiences. I'm not any kind of professional on this matter whatsoever. But I do think it's something really interesting to talk about and that I would love to share because consuming horror media has benefited my mental health so much, especially during these last 2 crazy years with the pandemic going on. So I just want to share my experiences and my thoughts on it. Anyhow, today I want to talk about what I've called the monster under your bed, and basically how the things that scared you as a child and the horror consumption that you had as a child basically benefited you later in life, and how darker media for children, though sometimes very frowned upon, can also be a release and a catharsis for kids. And I know it definitely helped me. It was something that I really engaged in as a kid, but nowhere near to the level that I do now. So I read this article that Stephen Graham Jones wrote for Crime Reads about why exposing your kids to horror can actually be a good thing. I actually think that was the name of the article. Why exposing your kids to horror might actually be good for them. And I think one of the most interesting things that he pointed out was this concept that you need to be able to process through things. He basically says, and this is his quote, "The way horror works, both for people in it and for the people watching or reading it, is that you process through." And that kind of goes back to what I said in episode 1 about how watching horror is almost this cathartic release that can help you pretty much have control over certain things and aspects in your life and feelings and anxieties and nervousness. And you can isolate those feelings and control them by knowing that you are just sitting through the movie, just reading the book, and at any time if you're uncomfortable, you can actually put those items down if you need to. Stephen Graham Jones actually argues that you need to go through the entire process of the film or the story to fully understand what's happening, to fully get that cathartic release. I do sort of agree with him in that sense of knowing what happens in the end, but I do also think that you are in control to put it down if you don't want to go any further. So I think for me it's interesting because I grew up to be such a huge horror fan, but as a kid I was pretty much scared of everything. Like, I will never forget being like, oh my god, I must have been 6 years old, and my stepdad took me to see Princess Mononoke in theaters, me and my cousin who was 2 years younger than me. And if you've ever seen Princess Mononoke, that opening scene with the boar covered in worms, to this day still really disturbs me. Like, it's very disturbing visual. And we were not expecting that. I grew up watching Kiki's Delivery Service, so I definitely had a love for Hayao Miyazaki at a very young age, and I think my stepdad thought it was going to be like another Kiki's Delivery Service. And then we get to Princess Mononoke, and there's this terrifying scene with this boar who's like going crazy and has this horrible death, and I just remember bursting into tears in the theater, and like I needed to leave. And I did not go back and rewatch Princess Mononoke probably until I was a teenager. And that scene just disturbed me so much. And it got me thinking that as a kid, there's so many times where you experience very horrific things and imagery that you don't necessarily think you're going to. Like you can walk into something very unintentionally and be scared, versus when you have that control of knowing that you're going to be consuming some type of media that is scary. Like for me, I could never ever really get through Courage the Cowardly Dog or Invader Zim or The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy because, well, one, you could see that they were scary stylized shows, so you knew that from the beginning, and then for me it did actually upset and disturb me while I was watching them, especially Courage the Cowardly Dog. The visuals in that were so terrifying. but then you take me accidentally walking into Princess Mononoke and having this false sense of, oh, this is going to be fine, and it's just not. So I always had the control to not have to watch the shows that really, really unnerved me. I noticed there's something really, really interesting about the difference between like visuals and imagery and what your imagination can come up with. And I think that's why as a kid, when it came to horror, I leaned almost entirely towards books to consume horror. I got introduced to horror through the Bunnicula books, the Lemony Snicket books, and Edgar Allan Poe. I started reading Edgar Allan Poe when I was in 4th grade because I saw The Simpsons spoof on The Raven where Bart's the Raven, and I was just like hooked. I thought it was so cool, and I remember reading The Raven and I think Annabelle Lee and The Telltale Heart in 4th grade in our library, and just being like, this is so cool. I've never read anything like this. It's like, again, more contained horror, and I know a lot of the language went over my head, so I never fully understood the full meaning of some of what Poe was saying when I was 9 years old, but I did really, really gravitate towards it. And I think it's because those visuals weren't laid out for me. They were more there so I could come up with them in my head. And I think that's why Bunnicula never scared me, Lemony Snicket never scared me, but I was so invested in what was going on in those stories that I needed to just keep reading and reading more. Eventually I did get to the Harry Potter books, and I remember reading The Chamber of Secrets, and the Aragog scene happened, and I'm so scared of spiders, and I read that book and it gave me nightmares. It was the first book to ever actually scare me, but I was able to continue reading the book. Versus when I went and saw The Chamber of Secrets in theaters, I literally walked out of the theater during the Aragog scene and like hid in the hallway until the spiders were gone. My stepdad came back and got me to tell me that the spiders were gone. And then right after that, or even maybe it was right before, I forget what the timeline was, the third Lord of the Rings movie came out, Return of the King, where Sam and Frodo like battle Shelob. I think that's her name. The giant spider. And for that, I just closed my eyes for the entire thing. And I think Aragog to me was even scarier than Shelob, but whatever. And so I just want to talk through some of the books that I think were very, very beneficial to me becoming a huge kind of horror fanatic, but also being able to steadily get over my fears as a kid and how they did benefit me. First up, I did already mention Edgar Allan Poe and my love of Edgar Allan Poe. He's been one of my favorite authors since, again, I was 9 years old. And I think a lot of it had to do with not only the brevity of his stories, but I think kind of the separation of like his time period and ours. Like he was just so far away and the language was so different, and like the visuals that you would get and the poems that he would create kind of made it like this almost like fun moment for a kid when you read these, what is it? I think it's dactylic octameter is what the Raven is written in, but there's this rhythm to it and you can remember it, and it almost makes it fun even though you're reading about this man slowly going insane. And I think kind of being a kid and being able to read about characters who weren't always happy and who had like negative things happen to them became something that you could relate to, because it's not always easy being a kid. You know, you get bullied, or if you're someone like me, you're the kid who like grows up weird, and when you read horror stories, you tend to see more characters similar to the weird kid. We can look at Beetlejuice and you see Lydia Dietz, you know, and she is the absolute star of that film, but she is an odd duck, and that was something that I always thought was really, really cool, to have like a main character who wasn't perfect. They weren't the stereotypical main character. Like the Baudelaire children in A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket were not your typical kids. You know, one really, really liked reading, one really, really liked inventing things, but they weren't these like social butterflies. They weren't the popular kids. You know, Sunny just like really liked biting things. And I always loved that, these kind of misfit characters that became the heroes of the story. And it was just so unique and fun and weird. And I remember, I believe it was Isadora Duncan, she was a character in the Lemony Snicket series, and she loved writing couplets. And at this time in my life, when I was in middle school and I was reading all the Lemony Snicket books, I loved Edgar Allan Poe. And again, I loved poetry and I loved the rhyme of it all. And to have a character whose whole thing was how much she loved writing like short poetry, I thought was so cool, because I was like the only person I knew who liked dark poetry and like gothic lit. And I think when you balance something like poetry and something like kind of sing-songy that is something so inherent to childhood, alongside other things like illustrations, is where again you get that ability to process through the scarier, darker things. So like I was saying, there's so many times where you see illustrations in children's stories, and it's usually to help the child, you know, imagine or see what's being told on the page. But there are certain times where that can be taken in a different direction. I think everybody who is growing up who's a huge like horror buff now probably has read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Or if you ever talk to anybody about reading those books and remembering those books, one of the first things everybody says is how terrifying the illustrations were. I know for me, I actually never read them as a kid. My stepdad would tell me the stories. When I would walk home from school, we had like a 25-minute walk from my school to my apartment that I was growing up in when I was about 8 years old, and he would always tell me one of the Scary Story to Tell in the Dark stories. So I never actually witnessed any of these like terrifying illustrations until like years and years and years later, you know, and just going through them now, like as a kid, like this image would be so disturbing, and yet you look at it as an adult and it's very, very beautiful. And I think it's just one of those things that, like, because this was created by adults for children, there's probably some kind of disconnect between the terror of the stories and the imagery that affects children on a much, much deeper level, but it sticks with you. And I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing, because again, if you look at these illustrations, they're not the most terrifying thing in the world. I've seen way more disturbing things in my life. But it's definitely a nice way to introduce kids to the darker side of things. Two other authors that do that very, very, very well are Tim Burton, and of course, one of my favorite like illustrators of all time, Edward Gorey. I'm going to talk about Edward Gorey first, because as a kid, my stepmom always had this particular book on our coffee table. And I always thought it was really interesting, because to me it looked like a children's book, but at the same time, I mean, it had this absolutely horrifying kind of Grim Reaper on it, and I was just so perplexed as to what it could possibly be. And I remember opening it up, and the entire thing is the ABCs of how these meet their demise. And it is, again, just these beautiful illustrations with these very, very questionable images inside of it. But again, they're very safe and they're very tame, and it just becomes another way to expose yourself to the not everything is happy and perfect in life. And then the same, of course, with the melancholy death of Oyster Boy and other stories. Again, just very, very similar concepts, but paired up with Tim Burton's art and written just like the Ashley Crumb Tinies in these kind of poetic, sing-songy prose. And I just think that's much more interesting and beneficial to the child to go into reading something like that than it would, say, like The Velveteen Rabbit. I remember my mom was very into the idea of relatability as a kid. So when I was, I believe, 6 years old, I got scarlet fever, and I had a stuffed rabbit that I took with me everywhere. And my mom bought me The Velveteen Rabbit because it was about a little boy who got scarlet fever and he had a stuffed rabbit. So when I had that, I remember reading it. But at the end of The Velveteen Rabbit, the rabbit has to be burned with all of the boy's belongings because it carries the disease. And that just traumatized me. I remember being lulled into this false sense of security in this safe space of thinking like, oh, like the little boy, he makes it through scarlet fever and he has a bunny that's just like me. And then immediately being like, oh my God, they're gonna take my rabbit. And it just absolutely devastated me, versus something, again, like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, where the absolute title tells you what you are in for. A series of unfortunate events tells you that it is going to literally be a series of unfortunate events, one right after the other. And then as I got older, I started to consume more and more media. I think The Halloween Tree is an interesting one. I don't particularly like this book, but it is a really interesting way to introduce younger readers to Ray Bradbury and the varying different concepts of Halloween. And it's another one that has these really interesting and yet bizarre illustrations to go alongside of it. Again, giving you the ability to create what's happening in your mind through like the text and everything, but then that visual aid in case you really need to know exactly what is going on. But like as a kid, this is not the most pleasant image, but as an adult, I think it's absolutely stunning. And then the last author I want to talk about that I think is absolutely vital to children consuming horror in kind of a safe way that prepares them for life are books like Coraline and The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Graveyard Book addresses a lot of things like being orphaned, feeling alone, finding friends in strange places, and then Coraline deals more with, again, kind of being the Lydia Dietz, the odd character out, different from everybody else, moving to a new place, leaving your friends behind, having parents who you feel don't fully understand you, and puts it in a very, like, again, scary metaphor of a story, but with things that kids can truly, truly relate to. And at the end of the day, we're telling stories about kids who feel alone to kids so that they don't have to feel alone, so they can have this relatability to these characters and process through certain things almost in a fantasy world that reflects back on reality. And I think there's just something about characters in horror stories that are just so much more tangible than characters in just traditional, like, happy-go-lucky stories that you read as a kid. I know I mentioned Harry Potter earlier, but I always disliked Harry Potter, the character, because even though, like, he was the boy who lived and he had a hardship and he lost his parents and he had these awful aunts and uncles and this questionable childhood, everything just kind of went right for him. Like, he always got what he needed. He was always the victor. He was always this kind of unrealistic character to me. He didn't have any quirky, weird flaws. He just kind of was the cliche superstar main character. And I always hated that, because to me, like, that wasn't me. I couldn't relate to that. You know, even Hermione and Ron, they were kind of difficult to relate to too, because there wasn't that much to them as characters. Hermione was very, very book smart. Ron was very, very street smart. Harry was very, very lucky and powerful. And that's kind of who they were. But then again, you would read stories about Violet Baudelaire and Klaus Baudelaire, and they were, again, these odd, inventive, kind of weird characters in these miserable situations who were able to best themselves through their quirkiness and escape. And I always thought that was so much cooler. And I think I always loved, like, the works of Tim Burton so much as a kid too, because I mean, the whole plot of The Nightmare Before Christmas is this character who has it all, but for some reason feels out of place and misunderstood and doesn't quite understand where he fits in or why, and wants to try something different. You know, there's a depressed skeleton that I related to more as a child than I did to Harry Potter. And I think that's just something that, again, continues through horror media today. We see so often today horror focusing on characters, and I said this in my last video, with mental health issues, who become the hero, who are the main character. They're not always the villain. And a lot of horror novels are, again, metaphors for different types of mental health and different types of struggles that we face in real life, even though maybe in that book we call our own battles a werewolf or a vampire, or the monster under our bed that we are scared to face alone at night. And I think horror is just a very safe place for you to see that you are not alone, and that you can face your demons and you can find relatability and connect more with these characters on pages than the cliche happy-go-lucky stories that we read growing up, because you know what? Life isn't happy-go-lucky. And I think we don't necessarily need to be disillusioned to that as children, but definitely being prepared for it and reading and consuming that type of horror media in a safe space, I do think helps you process through what you are seeing and understanding more about life as you get older. No, I'm not saying go and watch The Exorcist with your 5-year-old. Please do not do that. I watched that movie when I was 17 and I'm still terrified of it. But I just think that, you know, my stepdad always exposed me to, like, the really bad, cheesy horror films from, like, the 70s with, like, the really awful effects that, like, you would watch today and kind of, like, chuckle at how, like, not scary the effects are. And that terrified me. But I loved it. I loved it so much because those effects seemed so real to me, because it was just that step between, like, cartoonish and reality. And cartoons scared me, and the visuals scared me. And so when I discovered literature and I found a way that I could consume these cool, interesting concepts in like a safer, less visual way, I think it benefited me quite a lot. So yeah, that's just my take on why I think that exposing children to certain levels of horror when they're growing up isn't always a bad thing. It can actually be very beneficial as long as it's done in kind of a safe way and you give your kid control over what they consume and make sure that it's moderated so that you're not, again, having somebody watch like Night of the Living Dead at the age of 6. I think maybe that's a little bit too much, but I think that it's okay to be scared of the boogeyman in The Nightmare Before Christmas as a kid. I think it allows you to face your fears as you get older, and just kind of goes back to what I was saying about, you know, reading It when I got older. Like, I was able to face those fears. I was able to finally process through why I was scared of that clown as a kid when I'd only known him as a visual. When you actually read about Pennywise, you end up learning so much more about the character and what he represents than just that scary image. And being able to have characters like the Baudelaires and Coraline Jones to read about as a kid is just so nice, and knowing you're not alone, and even if you are the weird kid who likes darker things like Lydia Dietz, like, that's okay. You know, Lydia Dietz is the star of that story. Wednesday Addams is probably one of the most beloved characters in the Addams family. And Coraline Jones is the odd duck, and yet she is the hero of that story. The Baudelaires are the absolute main characters that you never usually see in stories. You know, you usually, again, get the cliche Harry Potter hero. And I'm so happy that as a kid I was able to see a full range of these different types of heroes that had to face some really dark things and were able to overcome them. And the imagery behind it, yes, was disturbing and was unsettling, but was very much rooted in reality while also being very safe for a child to consume. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. If you have any books that really helped you as a child, like really get into horror and process horror, and that you really connected to, I know I'm sure a lot of people will talk about R.L. Stine. Never really read him as a kid, unfortunately. But I just know that there's so much out there, and I think it's so interesting, and I really would love to hear your own personal stories about this. Anyways, as always, I post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. If you like these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah.